Nashville Design Week is a platform for bold collaborations and conversations that promote idea sharing, engage and educate the public, and strengthen our city's design culture. We shine a spotlight on designers who are shaping the city's future and facilitate critical conversation about the industry's growth and impact.
2020 has challenged us in every way. A tornado, a pandemic, and a long overdue reckoning with racial inequity. And as we close in on a formative election, we are excited to focus on the power of design to reshape communities and to actively support equity. We are proud to introduce a diverse range of speakers covering everything from racial injustice and inequity to diversity and inclusion, connectivity, and allyship, all through the lens of design.
We are fortunate to partner with design leaders who are invested in the future of Nashville's design community. These leaders see Nashville Design Week as essential and support making design discourse accessible to all. Thank you endlessly to our 2020 sponsors for helping us bring Nashville Design Week to life. Thank you to founding silver sponsor, Hastings. Hastings is a boutique architecture and interior design firm of 75 professionals who are deeply committed to the service of clients, producing award-winning, thoughtful, and impactful architecture. Thank you to silver sponsor, Watkins College of Art and O'Moore College of Architecture and Design at Belmont University. The Watkins College of Art and the O'Moore College of Architecture and Design celebrate the power of art and design to transform people, communities, cultures, and the world. Thank you to our copper sponsors, Elevated Outcomes, Interface, Smith G Studio, and Textures Nashville. Thank you to our bronze sponsors, Aberdeen Studio, Alfred Williams & Company, Circa Creative Studios, Dade, EOA Architects, Earl Swenson Associates, and Manuel Zeitlin Architects.
And thank you to our media partners, Dezeen, Lightning 100, and Nashville Interiors, and to creative directors Lindsay and Alan Lassiter.
Nashville Design Week is proud to be a fiscally sponsored project of the Arts and Business Council of Greater Nashville, a nonprofit organization. Nashville Design Week is an entirely volunteer effort made possible by the tireless dedication of our team. Now, let's get started.
Welcome to our event, Segregated by Design, a viewing and panel conversation. The hosts for this evening's program are Holly Deese, owner and publisher of Nashville Interiors magazine and longtime writer of the Nashville Ledger, and Joe Mays, project and program manager at Civic Design Center. We thank you all for being a part of Nashville Design Week 2020, and with that, I'll turn it over to the hosts.
My name is Holly Deese, and I am a writer with the Nashville Ledger, as well as publisher of Nashville Interiors magazine. Tonight, we're going to start the evening first off watching a 17-minute film by Mark Lopez, who is actually here with us tonight. This is a film, Segregated by Design, which really shows the history of federal, state, and local governments unconstitutionally segregating major metropolitan areas in the US through law and policy. Now, while the film does not specifically talk about Nashville, this did happen here. And so following the film, we are going to be speaking with a panel of people. Actually, I just realized right now are all native Nashvillians and can really speak to how this affected Nashville and how it is kind of shaping our neighborhoods now as we are going through some major development. So first on the panel is David Ewing, who is a 9th generation Nashvillian. He's a historian and the CEO of Nashville History on Tour. He has served on the Metro Historical Commission, the Metro Historic Zoning Commission, Metro Board of Zoning Appeals, and he really is kind of the go-to person on Nashville history related to anything zoning, architecture, civil rights, neighborhoods. Next on the panel, we have Kathy Trawick, who is the executive director of the Tennessee Fair Housing Council. Also a Nashville native. She was previously with the West Tennessee Legal Services and has served as a housing attorney and project director. Her mission with the Tennessee Fair Housing Council is to eliminate housing discrimination in Tennessee and really focuses on education and outreach. And then we have Odessa Kelly, native of Nashville, and she works as co-chair for Stand Up Nashville, which is a coalition of community-based organizations and labor unions that represent the working people of Nashville who have seen the city transformed by development, but have not necessarily shared in the benefits of the city's growth right now. Also, we have Joe Mays with the Civic Design Center, who I'm going to toss over to now to introduce Mark, the film director. Thanks.
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Joe. I'm the project and program manager at the Civic Design Center here in Nashville. Before we get into the program, I want to tell you a little bit about the Design Center and why we're co-hosting this discussion. So first off, our mission is to advocate for civic design visions, actual change in communities to improve the quality of life for all. So all over the country, organizations and community members are encouraging others to make sure their voices are heard, to make sure their votes are counted, and make sure their representation is ensured. The people are tired of their communities being designed to marginalize them instead of support them. So we all have to work on the side of the communities and amplify their voices. This is why the theme of the Civic Design Center's largest annual event is community-led change. We are not only hosting a unique keynote discussion this year, but also 10 community-led conversations on critical topics in planning and design professions. Local and national advocates will come together with the attendees to discuss how our community can create change responsibly. We hope this film and conversation on segregation will inspire you to lead change and join us on November 13th. So now I'd like to introduce Mark Lopez, the director, designer, and animator of Segregated by Design, who will tell you more about the inspiration behind the film and how the concept came together. Mark?
So this is my film. It took about 15 months to complete. It was a labor of love, and I felt like I needed to work on it when I learned about this history that I didn't know previously. And I knew that I needed this to be taught in schools because AP US history was like my favorite subject in high school, and I did not know any of this stuff. After working on it, luckily, I've heard back from a ton of professors from big universities and from high schools all over that want to include it in their curriculum. So I feel like this history might be starting to be taught, which is great. But now we got to do something about what has happened. So yeah, I hope that you guys learn quite a bit because I did in making it, and yeah, hope you enjoy it.
In the middle of the 20th century, the city of St. Louis, Missouri, and the United States federal government condemned and demolished the neighborhoods in downtown St. Louis where African Americans lived, displacing thousands. They built the Gateway Arch. They built a university, interstate highways, hospitals, and middle-class housing that was unaffordable to the former African American residents. Those who were displaced then relocated to the few other places available, converting inner-ring suburbs like Ferguson into new segregated enclaves. We have been led to believe that racial segregation in housing was de facto segregation, by accident or the result of private prejudices. Yes, private prejudice clearly contributed to segregation, but by itself it could not have segregated the country without the intention of the federal government to segregate neighborhoods throughout the nation. If, however, we understand the accurate history, the history that was once well known but we've all now forgotten, that racially segregated patterns in every metropolitan area like St. Louis were created by de jure segregation, racially explicit policy on the part of federal, state, and local governments designed to segregate metropolitan areas, then we can understand that we have an unconstitutional residential landscape. And if it's unconstitutional, then we have an obligation to remedy it. The federal government in the New Deal of the Roosevelt administration of the 1930s pursued policies in the mid-20th century that segregated metropolitan areas. One important policy was the first civilian public housing program, which frequently demolished integrated neighborhoods in order to create segregated public housing. In the late 1930s, another New Deal program, the United States Housing Authority, was adopted. The very first projects built under the United States Housing Authority authorization were in Austin, Texas. because the most aggressive proponent of public housing at that time was the congressman from Austin, Lyndon Baines Johnson. And Johnson got the United States Housing Authority to put its first projects in Austin, separate projects for whites, for African Americans, and a project for Hispanics. The project for African Americans was placed in a location that the city plan of Austin had designated as a ghetto for African Americans. The United States Housing Authority and the local Austin Housing Authority demolished something called Emancipation Park, which was a celebrations location for the abolition of slavery. The design was to move all African Americans in the city of Austin into this community, whether in public housing or in private housing. The city of Austin then began to close schools for African Americans elsewhere in the city and close libraries and other public facilities to force African Americans to move to the east side. Another program that the federal government pursued to enforce segregation was the work of the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, which subsidized the development of suburbs like Levittown, New York, on condition that they only be sold to white families and that the homes in those suburbs had deeds that prohibited resale to African Americans. The Federal Housing Administration's underwriting manual said that inharmonious racial groups should not be permitted to live in the same communities, meaning that loans to African Americans could not be insured. Government at all levels throughout the nation were involved in promoting and enforcing the restrictive deeds in homes and places like Levittown, and judges enforced the view that these deeds did not violate the Constitution because they were private agreements. Although white middle-class families that moved into suburbs like Levittown could buy property with no down payments if they were veterans and low-interest mortgages, middle-class African Americans had to make substantial down payments and get uninsured mortgages with higher interest rates. In many, if not most cases, African Americans could not get mortgages at all because the federal government would not insure them. As a result, they bought their homes on contract, like an installment plan where they accumulated no equity and could be evicted from their homes in the event of a single missed payment. Thus, contract buyers do not have the option of leaving a declining neighborhood before their properties were paid for in full. If they did, they would lose everything they'd invested in that property to date. The term redlining comes from the federal government's creation of maps of urban areas nationwide. And those maps were color-coded to indicate where it was safe to insure mortgages. Anywhere African Americans lived, even places where African Americans lived nearby, were colored red to indicate to appraisers that these neighborhoods were too risky for the FHA to insure. The FHA's justification was that if African Americans bought homes in white neighborhoods, or even if they bought homes near those neighborhoods, the property values of the homes they were insuring, the white homes they were insuring, would decline, and therefore their loans would be at risk. In 1940, for example, a Detroit builder was denied FHA insurance for a project that was near an African American neighborhood. He then constructed a half-mile concrete wall, 6 feet high and a foot thick, separating the two neighborhoods, and then the FHA approved the loan. In the 3 decades during which it administered this policy, however, the agency never provided or obtained evidence to support its claim that integration undermined property values. In fact, often racial integration caused property values to increase because African Americans' housing supply was so restricted and they had so many fewer choices. If African Americans had access to housing throughout metropolitan areas, supply and demand balances would have kept their rents and home prices at reasonable levels. Without access, landlords and sellers were free to take advantage of the greater demand relative to supply for African American housing. A 1946 National Magazine article described a Chicago building where the landlord had divided a 540 square foot storefront into 6 cubicles, each housing a family. He had similarly subdivided the second story. Total monthly rent was as great as that generated by a luxury apartment on Chicago's Gold Coast along Lake Michigan. Such exploitation was possible only because public policy denied African Americans opportunities to participate in the city's white housing market. As the federal government concentrated low-income African Americans in single neighborhoods, the homes became overcrowded. Families had to subdivide their homes to make their mortgage payments or their property tax payments. Cities frequently withdrew public services from African American neighborhoods. They collected garbage less frequently. They didn't provide water and sewer services. Polluting industry and toxic waste plants were placed in African American communities in order to protect white neighborhoods from deterioration. The result was that African American neighborhoods frequently turned into slums. White homeowners looked at these places and assumed that slum conditions were characteristics of African Americans, not of government policy that forced this kind of overcrowding. White homeowners then became resistant to African Americans moving into their neighborhoods because they thought they would bring slum conditions with them. Of course, the slums were not created by the people. They were created by the forced concentration, the overcrowding in these neighborhoods. Blockbusting was a scheme in which speculators bought properties in borderline black-white areas, rented or sold them to African-American families at above-market prices, persuaded white families residing in these areas that their neighborhoods were turning into African-American slums and that values would soon fall precipitously, and then purchased the panicked white homes for less than their worth. Blockbusters' tactics included hiring African-American women to push carriages with their babies through white neighborhoods, hiring African-American men to drive cars with radios blasting through white neighborhoods, or making random telephone calls to residents of white neighborhoods and asking to speak to someone with a stereotypically African-American name, like Johnny May. State licensing agencies that regulated real estate agents could have easily stopped this practice. All they had to do was to lift the license of one or two real estate agents who engaged in these practices, and the practices would have ended. While many de jure segregation policies aimed to keep African Americans far from white residential areas, public officials also shifted African American populations away from downtown business districts so that white commuters, shoppers, and business elites would not be exposed to black people. This was accomplished with slum clearance. One slum clearance tool was the construction of the federal interstate highway system. In many cases, state and local governments, with federal acquiescence, designed interstate highway routes to destroy urban African American communities. In the 1950s, there was a white middle-class neighborhood in Los Angeles that wealthy African Americans began to move into. It was called Sugar Hill. The first thing that happened was that the neighborhood association got together and tried to buy out the African American families who were moving in, offering them more money than the African Americans had paid in order to get them out of the neighborhood. When that didn't work, white homeowners tried to enforce a legal agreement prohibiting them from living in the neighborhood. And when that didn't work, the city council then decided it would be an African American neighborhood. It rezoned it for multiple family housing. It eventually became a slum. And then the Santa Monica Freeway was built to clear that slum to destroy the neighborhood. So these policies all worked together in an unconstitutional fashion to segregate Los Angeles. In 1957, Bill and Daisy Myers were able to purchase a home in Levittown, Pennsylvania, the Levitt Company's second large development. When the mail carrier discovered that he was delivering mail to an African-American family, he let everyone in the neighborhood know, and as many as 600 white demonstrators soon showed up in front of the Myers' house, pelting the family and their home with rocks. Law enforcement stood by as this happened. For 2 months, rocks were thrown, crosses were burned, the Ku Klux Klan symbol was painted on the wall next door. Some policemen stood with the mob, joking and encouraging its participants. One sergeant was actually demoted to patrolman because he objected to orders he had been given not to interfere with the rioters. In 1951, World War II veteran Harvey Clark, his wife Janetta, and 2 small children rented an apartment in all-white Cicero, a suburb of Chicago. When the Clarks refused to leave, a mob of 4,000 rioted, raiding the apartment, destroying the fixtures, and throwing the family's belongings out the window onto the lawn where they were set ablaze. Time magazine reported that the police officers present, quote, acted like ushers politely handling the overflow at a football stadium, unquote. The only people that the grand jury indicted were Harvey Clark, his real estate agent, his NAACP attorney, and the white landlady who rented the apartment to him, as well as her attorney, on charges of inciting a riot and conspiring to lower property values. Stories like this were commonplace, and state-sponsored violence was a means, along with many others, by which all levels of government maintained segregation. Today, African American incomes are about 60% of white incomes. But African American wealth is about 10% of white wealth. Most middle-class families in this country gain their wealth from the equity they have in their homes. So this enormous difference between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is almost entirely attributable to federal housing policy implemented through the 20th century. African American families that were prohibited from buying homes in the suburbs in the 1940s and 50s, and even into the 60s by the Federal Housing Administration, gained none of the equity appreciation that whites gained. Across the country in new developments, these homes in the late 1940s and 1950s sold for about twice national median income. They were affordable to working-class families with an FHA or VA mortgage. African Americans were equally able to afford those homes as whites, but were prohibited from buying them. Today, those homes sell for $300,000 to $400,000 at the minimum, 6 to 8 times national median income. The white families sent their children to college with the wealth they gained from appreciating home equity. They were able to take care of their parents in old age and not depend on their children. They were able to bequeath wealth to their children. None of those advantages accrued to African Americans, who for the most part were prohibited from buying homes in those suburbs. So in 1968, we passed the Fair Housing Act that said, in effect, okay, African Americans, you're now free to buy homes in the suburbs that had been forbidden. But it's an empty promise, because those homes are no longer affordable to the families whose parents or grandparents could have afforded them when whites were buying into those suburbs and gaining the equity and wealth that followed from their purchases. Consider children who come from families where they're economically stressed, or in poor health because they have no access to good health care, or because they live in polluted environments. When they do come to school, for example, they may suffer from asthma because of that pollution and are drowsy from being awake at night, wheezing. They cannot then typically achieve at levels of children who come to school well-rested. When you concentrate children like that in single classrooms, it's impossible for teachers to develop the kind of outcomes that they can in middle-class children who come to school healthy, unstressed, and able to pay attention to schooling. What economists know is that African American children from low-income families who grow up in segregated neighborhoods are less likely as adults to move into the middle class than are African American children whose families have the same low incomes but who live in integrated neighborhoods. So segregation itself impedes intergenerational mobility and perpetuates, rigidifies the inequality that we experience. Another thing that social psychologists have discovered is that decision-making is hampered when you don't have diverse decision-making groups. These psychologists have done experiments where they put people together to solve problems in both diverse groups and in segregated groups. And the diverse groups are much better able to solve problems because they challenge assumptions much more than the segregated groups do. So segregation impedes our political and economic success. We have 3 provisions in the federal Constitution that prohibit the kinds of actions that federal, state, and local governments pursued to create residential segregation. One is the 5th Amendment, which requires the federal government to treat all citizens fairly. Another is the 14th Amendment that requires state and local governments not only to treat citizens fairly, but to treat them equally. And then the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, also requires that we banish the effects of slavery, which Congress long ago determined was any form of second-class citizenship. So in fact, the prohibition on African Americans to purchase homes in federally subsidized white communities or the segregation of public housing created a form of second-class citizenship, which was a violation of the 13th Amendment. We cannot reverse de jure segregation mainly with lawsuits. We must also build a national political consensus leading to legislation, a challenging but not impossible task. Our focus now should be to develop policies that promote an integrated society, understanding it will be impossible to fully untangle the web of unconstitutional inequality that we've woven. To begin, we should first contemplate what we have collectively done and, on behalf of our government, accept responsibility to fix it.
Hello, everyone. My name is Odessa Kelly. As Holly said earlier, I'm a native of Nashville. I am the executive director for Stand Up Nashville, so glad to be here.
Awesome. Kathy?
Hi, I'm Kathy Trawick. I'm the executive director of the Tennessee Fair Housing Council, and I am originally from Nashville. My father was actually an architect here, but we grew up mostly in West Tennessee, where he did a lot of his work before moving back. I moved back about 3 years ago.
Awesome. And David?
I'm David Ewing, a native Nashvilleian, as Holly said. My family's been here over 220 years. I'm a historian and follow everything housing, architecture, and politics here.
All right, great. Well, I'll just go off the first question that she's kind of got going, and hopefully she'll be able to join us soon. So, I guess what specifically happened in Nashville that mirrors what we saw in the film? So, talking about loan practices, housing opportunities, the interstate, and blockbusting. So, anybody wants to start off the conversation?
I guess I'll start. I'll talk about the public housing. Nashville was late in the game to have publicly funded housing. It happened under Franklin Roosevelt during the Great Depression. He realized that people were not having suitable housing and housing stock in cities like Nashville. Many were 30, 40, 50 years old from the 19th century and not up to modern standards. So he developed this program that they said that Lyndon Johnson was kind of also responsible for. And just like a lot of things back then, it was segregated. So even in Nashville, most people don't know this, the Casey Homes was a white housing development, as was Vine Hill, and Napier and Andrew Jackson were for African Americans. So those public housing communities were built segregated, like most cities.
Are you done, David? I didn't want to know.
Yes.
Because David is a wealth of knowledge, so we know that he can, he's usually I would call to validate stuff. But to your question, Joe, all of it, from me just sitting here taking notes. Mr. Lopez, you did a great job putting this film together. One of the things that it talked about is that it closed schools, libraries, and public facilities, right? That is, can you give me another definition of domestic terrorism? You're literally pushing people into surveillance areas. If you fast forward to today, we talk about surveillance and all of these relocation tactics that are happening, it's still happening. One of the things I put down here too is that, the inharmonious groups part, I found that interesting, when it said basically what it's like, how does that look on a recorded record, right? Because I think we have to talk deeper than what actually happened, than what is the psychological, damage that happens to white generations that come after that, right? Because basically instead of just saying that this is a blatant racist tactic, what we started doing is building language that says, oh, well, we can't insure your home, to make white people feel more comfortable with the things that they were doing. So just thinking about, those things that happen. It also, too, that created predatory lending. Basically, when it talked about trapping people into those areas, if you fast forward today, that's how we have all these advanced financials and all the predatory, checking the cash places that we have on the corners. Our public policies literally created that market. I didn't really understand that until looking at this film. When it came down, it was talking about the justification is the property value. What does that say, right? That basically says that and that's when they were talking about, I think Levittown at that point. So basically it's saying that it's telling for white people, money is more important than morality. because it's like, hey, your bank loan, you want your property value is going to go down. So that's the justification for you to ignore this immoral thing that is happening. You know, so I mean, when you think about that, and you create these like slums that it went into, I think part 3 or part 4 that you talk about. Not only did you create like a wealth inequity, I mean, Black bodies have always been wealth in this country, right? So there's always been inequity and inequality in how that's happened. But then what happened is for 30 years, in the same way that compound interest accrues is the same way that poverty accrues, right? And that's not just talking about financially, but look at the mental status and the psychological damages that it does when you overcrowd communities with people together, right? Literally, we're saying that every crux that we have today is created out of public policy. So I believe everything in the film happened right here in Nashville, and we can like draw similarities to everything.
And Mark, I want to add one more thing that was in your film that most Nashvillians don't know that we did too. It wasn't necessarily based on race. Vanderbilt University, the area around Dudley Field, was a residential neighborhood. And the neighborhood activist at the time in the 60s was named Fannie Mae Dees. And she saw Vanderbilt buying up houses and land to tear them down and pushing nice families out so they could buy it for cheap. I have a friend who's a musician who went to Vanderbilt during that time. She was white. She was kind of a hippie. I see Manuel Zeitlin on the call. I'm sure he knows who this is. She still lives here. And Vanderbilt basically asked her and a lot of what they called undesirable people to move over to that area to push out the good white families so they could buy it for cheap. And so, you know, this person sunbathed on their porch, played loud music, you know, smoked. And so those kind of things happened here. And if it weren't for Fannie Mae Dees, Vanderbilt wanted to cross the street where Blakemore is today and basically buy a bunch of houses over there. But she stopped them from doing that. But they got the area around the football stadium, which are the parking lots that you see today in the track. Those were all residential houses over there.
So, Joe, to your question, a little bit of statistics, and in 1933 was when the HOLC, the housing mortgage and the FHA loans came about. And before that, it was an individual type, the banks would finance homes for maybe 5 or 10 years. And so in 1933, it was part of the New Deal and supposedly to help stabilize the mortgage system. And they were allowing people to make mortgages for 25 years, 30 years. But in doing so, then they created these maps, and they were called housing security maps. And there's a couple of them in the handout section that everyone can look at. And a lot of times you see the red areas, and they did have red lines drawn around them. A lot of times you see the maps colored where it goes to green for the desirable areas. But I chose these. These were put together by the University of Richmond. And what I liked about them, because it gives a reference, because you see the zip codes. And when you're from Nashville, you understand what those zip codes mean, and you understand the wealth that's associated with them. So if you can picture, and if you look at these handouts, the part that's the darkest gold would be colored green. But the red is the area where typically minorities lived. And they said that it was a higher risk of mortgages, and you couldn't get those mortgages. The deed for contract that they've talked about, we sometimes refer to them as rent to rent, because like it was stated, you're not building any equity. in these contract for deeds, and you can be evicted even though you technically are buying the house. You can still be evicted for missing a payment. So essentially, you're renting the home that you think you're buying. And a lot of people don't understand what's going on, and they think that they're buying it until they have an insurance claim and find out that no, the owner, the landlord, gets the insurance check, and whether he fixes it up or not is up to him. But they in one of the links, I believe Joe posted, I would encourage everybody to look at this. It's, I think, by the library, mapping the destruction of Tennessee's African American neighborhoods. That is an amazing site, and it's full of information, and it talks about how the construction of the interstate was intentionally put along Jefferson Street. And of course, they tried to say, you know, well, that was the least disruptive to businesses, but really what it meant was it was the least disruptive to white businesses. That the white people who voted, the white people who supported them, it was the least disruptive to them.
David, could you speak more about that? Because we talked about that pretty extensively, about the interstate coming to Nashville and how devastating that was to certain neighborhoods.
One of the things, yes, I will, but one of the things I wanted to follow up on what Kathy said about the kind of redlining is we have kind of a redlining that we use today, but most people don't even realize it was based on race and on class. And I noticed that there was a comment on the comment section talking about Mark, your film needs to be shown at the realtors ethics classes. The realtors and the newspapers all got together in the 60s and basically came up with a map of Nashville. And the so-called Area 2, which is Music Row, West End, Hillsborough Village, Green Hills was the desirable area. And they carved a bunch of other non-desirable or all African-American neighborhoods into one area. And we use these same areas today in every single real estate ad. You will see them promote something like, this is an Area 2 home, or this is out here. And those were originally done just to segregate and be very exclusive and basically draw a line outside of the African American neighborhood. So that's why Area 2 looks the way it is today. Getting back to the interstate the film talked about Lyndon Johnson being the father of public housing. The father of the interstate system was a Tennessean by the name of Al Gore Sr. And Al Gore Sr. convinced President Eisenhower, that this system of roads, federal highways across America would be good, and the federal government needed to pay for it. And they funded it, but then they left it up to the local cities kind of to say exactly where the interchanges would be and where everything would go. And so here in Nashville, the interstate system devastated Jefferson Street. They could have easily had it follow Metro Center in the river, but they just kind of literally threw it through Jefferson Street. And as we know, or you might not know, it basically cut off the African American community from each other. So if you had like a neighborhood you grew up in a couple blocks away where your friend's house or a school or a business, the interstate just took that out, and there was no easy way to get from one block to another. And it took out some of our most famous Black businesses in Nashville at the time. One was the Ritz Theater, which was on Jefferson Street across from Jubilee Hall. And why that was important, during the 50s and 60s, African Americans could not go to white movie theaters and sit in the downstairs part. They had to enter through an alley, go up some stairs, and sit in the balcony. The Ritz Theater, you could walk through the front door and sit down there. The interstate literally cut off the back part of the Ritz Theater where the screen was, so that building was destroyed. It destroyed one of our most famous clubs on Jefferson Street, Club Del Morocco, where Jimi Hendrix and Ray Charles and James Brown played. Club Del Morocco is on Jefferson Street near the interstate intersection, but it's literally the exit ramp down to Jefferson Street. Club Del Morocco was right there. And so they could have, put it somewhere else, but they just took out that. And Jefferson Street has never been the same. The property values have never been the same. The business has never been the same. Pre-interstate, Jefferson Street looked like West End. And after the interstate, you see empty lots, you see businesses that never kind of came back, and you see a whole area that just has never recovered and probably won't.
What was the reasoning for the interstate being placed there? I mean, we had talked about this in the article. There was other options.
Right. Well, the other options, there were no stakeholders from the African American community got to kind of plan the interstate. They just decided, we're going to put it through here. I don't think the white businessmen that, planned to put the interstate through, I don't think they thought purposely that they were going to destroy the African American neighborhood. They just didn't know the consequences, and they didn't bother to ask anyone. Had they asked someone, they would have all said, no, this isn't good for us, or push it somewhere else. But it literally just kind of followed Jefferson Street parallel for the heart of it. Interestingly enough, those Nashvillians might remember when we built Interstate 440, that was a totally different process. Though the 440 had very little impact on the residential neighborhood, although the people in Hillsborough Village still complained because a few of the houses were torn down. But the loop of 440 has a very old history to it. Jerry Baxter had a railroad at the turn of the century 100 years ago called the Tennessee Central Railroad. And it was a short line railroad that basically looped the city. And so basically 440 is the old railroad tracks of the Tennessee Central, and they had to widen it a little. So there might have been a couple of houses here and a couple of houses there that were destroyed. But that was an interstate that was put in, since they just used an old railroad route, that was not disruptive at all, hardly.
Now, did anyone benefit from the interstate going? I mean, obviously there was a lot of loss. What was gained other than transportation? Anyone?
Well, I'll just answer it. Commerce. We have 3 interstates coming through the city, and a lot of goods and services and people decide where their interstates. I think only Indianapolis has more interstates than we do. And I think it was really because of Al Gore Sr. that we decided that Nashville probably got 3 interstates during that time. We were not a big deal city. But, when you think about, a direct route to Memphis or Louisville or Birmingham or Knoxville, it made it very easy. If you think about our old system pre-interstate, how you got to the airport or how you got to certain parts of town, all these roads with names on them, like Murfreesboro Road, that's the road that went down to Murfreesboro. Franklin Road went down to Franklin. Clarksville Highway, that's how you went to Clarksville. And so that's how you got around before the interstate. And that's why back then you had all these restaurants and little motels open up there, because the travelers, that's how they got into the city when they were coming to see the Opry or just coming into Nashville before the interstates.
As this is all, as Nashville's growing and we're talking about the neighborhoods in our past, there's a fine line between revitalization and gentrification. So how do we go about now, today, finding some kind of balance amidst all this development? There's some neighborhoods that probably it's too late.
It's definitely public policy. I think that's all democracy is rooted in public policy, and that's something that we have to change. One thing I would push back a little bit against Mr. Lopez is in the film, that is when you talked about segregation. I think segregation is a cautionary tale. And the reason being is he says that, diversity is like the key to making things better. But if we were talking from a public school standing, there'd be a lot of conversation around that. It's like you need whole people to be that's the point of like raising children well, right? Is you want them to grow into whole people who can function. And there's an angst that goes into that now, especially a lot of African Americans who come out of 5 generations of public housing and poverty, right? So it's like, do you have all the capabilities and tools? Those things have been stripped out systematically by poverty, by systematic racism. So, when we talk about that, we have to really think about what that means. Why can't we build African American communities just as well as like all white communities don't need desegregation, right? To like make it economically, right? How desegregation helps white communities is by challenging the racial stereotypical things that have come out of enslaved slavery. So it's like, why is it that for anything that's all Black to survive, it has to be desegregated? So just thinking about it from that standpoint is something that we really need to do. Also, I can go all day. I'll stop right there. Kathy, jump in.
Well, no, I mean, there is a fine line between renewal and gentrification that on the surface, it seems like it's good because the theory is you're rehabbing neighborhoods. But if you come into neighborhoods and tear down the houses and build back much larger homes, on the one hand, it looks like you're revitalizing the neighborhood. However, the property values increase, but then you have people who've lived there forever. Maybe their parents lived there or they've retired there and their home is paid for. And all of a sudden property taxes go up because the housing in the housing stock. And so people are priced out of their homes simply because their property taxes have gone up. And that's where you start harming the families that have been there. And then we have a lot of outside developers coming in, not ones from Nashville, but ones from New York and California coming in, and they'll make a lowball offer on someone's home. And the person may, if they resist and say, no, I don't want to move, Nashville also allows for anonymous tips to be made to the codes department. And people will call in, the developers call in to the codes department, and they come back out to this person's home and they've lived there forever. It's not dilapidated, but it's like any older house. Maybe the porch is sagging just a little bit or something because they've gotten older, they can't get out and fix it. So codes tells them you have to fix it, and they don't know where the money is coming from. So then the developer can come back in and put in another offer, and the family feels like now they have to, they don't have a choice. They can't fix it, so they feel like they've got to move. And that's really a compilation. I've known of pieces of that individually happening, but that's kind of a compilation, like everything thrown together. There are ways that fair housing can help older people who aren't able, because they're people with disabilities, get more time, but to make repairs, but they're not aware of this. They don't know this.
if I can hop back in just for a second. So I always wonder, like, what is the difference between gentrification, revitalization, and renewal? Because as an African American, none of it has ever, been prosperous or helpful to our communities, right? I was born and raised here in East Nashville, went to Stratford High School and on, right? On the street that I live on now, it was 99.9% African American. I believe me and another Black family are the only two Black families left. To speak to everything that you talked about, Kathy, everything that you just spoke of, right? And it goes back to, like, when I say public policy, it's the lack of public policy. What David was talking about earlier, being a group of stakeholders, And one thing I will say, we were talking about these white businessmen who were on the Interstate committee, like, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? So no matter how good their intentions are, the impact is still what it was, which David already knows that and fully understands. But, we really have to be cognizant of that. At Stand Up Nashville, we passed a Do Better bill, which is now the Do Better law. Basically, what it was is a report card of where all our public dollars were going. We could only get it applied to pilots, which is short for payment in lieu of taxes. That means when businesses are moving to Nashville and want to get a public good for something they're doing. And also for cash grants, which Nashville is giving out like candy. That means we'll give you a $500 incentive for how many jobs you say you're going to create for Nashville, right? And there's no enforcement on that. So when we looked at, like, what is the rubric for people to get these? Like, who are the people that sit on this board? What does it look like to have accountability around that? None of it was built in, which is why we did the Do Better bill. There's only been 2 companies so far to date to go in front of that. That has been Amazon and that's been Alliance Bernstein, right? And if you don't know, you need to go study what happened when companies like Amazon moved in on cities like Seattle, right? We're just going to exacerbate the displacement that is already at an all-time high here taking a place in Nashville. And to go back to speak what you were talking about earlier, David, too, now it's more than a racial issue. It is a class issue, right? That we often disguise as just a race issue. In a capitalistic society, race can only take you so far in how you oppress people. Eventually, it does become a class issue, so a certain people can stay at the top. And that is exactly what is happening across the urban core of Nashville. If you look at South Nashville and the North-South areas to what's going on now in North Nashville, District 21, 73% is renters. 73% is renters. Now, someone please, some of you may have the numbers. How many people there are Black that are actually buying homes? The overwhelming majority are white. And it goes back to all those things we were talking about. Kathy just talked about them giving money to people to sell their homes. These people then turned around and found out there was no place in Nashville that could go and rebuy a home, which is why Murfreesboro, Lebanon, Smyrna blew up, Antioch blew up. So when we try to push public policy to keep that from happening, all of a sudden we can. Kathy talked about there being property rate freezes for seniors, right? Well, when we tried to get that lowered during COVID,
it's 6 o'clock.
Excuse me, in COVID, I never know what time it is. So when we tried to get that lowered, and when I say we Stand Up Nashville, talk about that to get Governor Lee to suspend that, it was preempted by the state. The state has set the limit for property tax freezes, so we can't lower the rate so people can be protected in the homes they are, especially those on fixed incomes. So we really have to look at public policy and how we're pushing it and how we're moving it. We had to get a community benefits agreement, basically using the tactics that white people used back in the 1930s to discriminate, to get some equity in how development was going to happen. The reason we had to do a community benefits agreement is because it was a private agreement. Had we gone through public legislation, the state would have preempted us, right? So a lot of times I get irritated, not with anyone here on this panel, but when we talk about these conversations, it's like, if we're going to talk about redlining, it's like, how do we put it into action? Because people will say, well, we had a conversation about redlining. I'm like, okay, great. Well, let's have a conversation about the public policies and how we put the elected officials in place and hold them accountable to it. No one wants to have that conversation. So I'm hoping we're getting to a point where we can really start pushing and looking at how we actively change these things.
Yeah.
And what Odessa was talking about preempting things, there are laws that the state legislature has passed that don't allow cities and municipalities to enact progressive type ordinances that aren't done on the state level. If I'm saying that correctly, right, Odessa, that you like when Nashville wanted to or enacted that inclusive inclusionary zoning, correct. And then the state came in and said, no, cities can't enact these separate protections or protections. And so for a while, Memphis had a source of income protection, meaning that someone who was otherwise eligible could not be denied housing based on the source of income. In other words, if there was a voucher or different types of income can be discriminated against. People will try and deny housing to people who draw Social Security because it can't be garnished. But actually, that's what they say, but actually, they don't want someone with a disability living there. And so without that source of income protection any longer, then landlords have ways of discriminating with a smile and excluding people who should otherwise be able to get housing. And so, you know, there's got to be some sort of meaningful change, not a revolution, but an evolution. It's got to come, you know, from the bottom up and get buy-in from the state legislators, but and stopping some of the radical gentrification. And by that I mean when people just come in and tear down houses and build these tall and skinnies, or build things that are completely out of character for the neighborhood, and then raise the property taxes and everything else.
And not only that, we also need to look at the other, not just like housing policy, but the other policies around it. One of the things that Mark talked about is that everyone was in on this, right? So it wasn't FHA. Like, as you showed how police were kind of the enforcement tool, you know, that's another system that happened. Same thing we need to do today. We passed a local hire initiative back here in 2015 as well, right? Basically, if you look, what are the two largest Black populations in the state of Tennessee? Memphis and Nashville, or Davidson County, right? We passed a local hire, and with that said, the background is that our unemployment rate in Nashville is lower than the national average, right? That's great. Yet our poverty rate tinkers anywhere between 18 and 20%. Majority of those are being people of color, African Americans, right? So if we were passing in a local hire initiative that said 40% of all public jobs had to hire Davidson County residents, that means you're gonna be putting Black people or minorities to work, right? The state came in and stripped that out. So now Black people don't have the means to want, let's say that we change every housing law to give it equity, right? We haven't changed any of the public policy that gives us an equal footing, right, to be able to ascertain or gain the wealth, you know, that's needed to have like a pathway out of poverty to even get into those places. So we just can't look at those laws. We have to look at the other things too. And it happens, they play against each other. As he talked about, it was the local, the state, and the federal government. Well, if you look at today and take a foot back, right, one just tosses the blame to the other. We can't do nothing because the state says we can't do it, right? Then the state says, well, like, you know, we can't have union jobs because of Janus, which the federal government passed, right? You know, why? I don't know why we're so anti-union in this state when unions actually literally build pathways out of poverty. But once it starts giving access to more than just white men, we have an issue with it. So if we're really going to have conversations and really want to change this, one thing, Kathy, I hope it is revolutionary. I wish we just throw this skill away that we work on and build it from the bottom up. That's what's really
that would be great. But you know, sometimes you got to catch more flies with honey in there. I don't know. That's why, Odessa, you and I are going to talk next week. Yes, but, no, it is. It's everything is interwoven, and housing well, housing's what I do, but housing is, without stable housing, it impacts your health, it impacts the kids' mental health, and where they, are having to move a lot, their stability. Housing is at the bottom. If you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, go back to that. And so it's a part of it, but you're right, Odessa. It has to be the full conversation. It's not just housing. And you're exactly right as far as affordable housing and the lack of it here in Nashville. There's a lot of big outside corporations coming in and purchasing properties that were tax credit properties and taking them off of the tax credit program and slapping a little paint on them and jacking the rent. It's not illegal necessarily, and it's unfortunate. I have to tell my clients a lot of the time that not everything that's unfair or unethical is illegal. It should be, right, but it's not. So
I would like to talk about urban renewal and the impact that it had on Nashville in the 50s. So my great grandparents lived right next to the state capitol. When I say right next to the state capitol, you know where the Tennessee Supreme Court is, on the corner of Martin Luther King and 7th. They lived in the parking lot. There was a 2-story house that they lived in. And then my great-great-grandfather's twin brother lived on the corner of Gay Street and 7th. Gay Street used to come all the way up behind the Capitol. So where that little guard shack is when you go up to the Capitol, his house, which was a nice kind of Victorian brick house from the 19th century, was right there. Urban renewal took out that whole neighborhood around the Capitol, which was mainly an African-American neighborhood going to the west and going down the hill. There were 4 African-American churches that lost their homes during that time, and a whole community basically from where the Capitol is all the way to where the Interstate is today. And they just tore it down, cleaned it out, and just moved those Black people somewhere else. And that neighborhood was called Hell's Half Acre back then. I guess not the kindest of name, but in the 50s, we built kind of these. It was one of the first urban renewal projects in America. We built these civic boulevards and government buildings. We built a new auditorium, municipal auditorium, James Robertson Parkway. And so we also lost our African-American business district. Everyone just assumes that Jefferson Street has always been the African-American business district, and that's not true. From where Municipal Auditorium is on 4th to Union Street, that was the African-American business district. That's where the Black doctors and bankers and lawyers and undertakers and businesses are. And the Morris Building, which is right there on the corner of 4th and Martin Luther King, is the last piece of the African-American business district, and it truly must be saved. It is our Black Ryman. Was designed by McKissick and McKissick. It was opened in 1924. It was built by Black people, for Black people, with Black financing, and it's truly a landmark in this city. Sadly, it is for sale right now, and you know what happens to 4-story buildings in downtown Nashville on good land. So that whole area, when people got cleared out there, they started to migrate more north, Jefferson Street, and then Bordeaux was created. The other very valuable piece of land right now that African Americans used to live on was the area they call Sobro today, which was called Black Bottom then. So think from the river to where the arena is, south of Broadway, that was Black Bottom. That was a poor African-American neighborhood, started after the Civil War, and around 1910, the city just kind of cleared it out and just tore down all the houses and cleared everyone out. And that's why the neighborhood of Edge Hill has such a large Black population today, or used to, that's where the people that lived in Black Bottom migrated to, that area over there. So our city has, sadly, a lot of history of just moving Black people out of their very valuable centrally located land to other places, or make them thin for themselves. And then the other thing developers do, which they've done, is take an old African American neighborhood and rebrand it to something else that is more acceptable. So I grew up here in Nashville. I remember the area that they call 12 South today. We call that Sevier Park.
That's
That
right.
was a Black neighborhood. And, you know, it was rebranded, and oh, it's 12 South, and here come the different kind of people moving in. And the other neighborhood that got rebranded was called Trimble Bottom. Trimble Bottom was a poor Black neighborhood, and it was over where the Greer Stadium is today. And now, of course, they call it
Chestnut.
the Chestnut Hill, or, you know, that area over there. But those were Black neighborhoods, and our history is gone, and our people are gone, and our housing is gone. And like Odessa said, we've been pushed out of the county and pushed to farther reaches of the county. And as you said, and Mark, in your film, your great film, that the equity and the valuable real estate is not owned. As I've been looking around downtown Nashville, the Interstate Loop, the old city of Nashville, inside the Interstate, I can only think of two major buildings that are owned by African Americans. Two. One is my church, First Baptist Church, Capitol Hill, and the other is the Morris Building, which is for sale. So you see all these buildings downtown. I don't think one of them is owned by an African American, and that's just really sad.
Mm-hmm. Holly, we can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. Okay, sorry. I think we're going to go to Q&A at this point. I see a lot of questions coming through the chat. Let's see. Sarah, did you have any compiled, or? Let's see. And if anyone wants to go ahead and put questions in the chat now, go ahead. So one of these questions is for you, Mark. They want to know about your process for representing these injustices, and how can either use design to better represent Nashville's history. Let's see. So yeah, how did you go about, what was the process for animating this?
Yeah, well, so you know, my paying job is doing commercials and explainer videos and that sort of stuff. So this was my first like film that I kind of did, but I approached it the same way I do my like commercial work, which is you write a script, you storyboard it out, and and come up with interesting ways to represent complex ideas, make them simple, make them easy to understand, because these are like really important things that kind of can be easy to gloss over if you're like reading a long informational book, which is what The Color of Law is. It's like really good book, but it's like not many people want to sit and read like the amount of data that is in that book. And so the trick is to try to simplify it and make it something that someone will want to, you know, a high schooler will want to sit down and watch, and stay into it. So yeah, you create fast moving, you know, you break down every paragraph into little blocks and kind of figure out what can I represent that in a good way with. So like, for example, like in the beginning where he's talking about the government, you know, was de jure segregation, where I'm trying to explain what that means. Where you kind of see the two homes on the bottom, but you don't really know how they're getting filled up. And so I was like thinking of the Plinko board in The Price is Right, and how like that could represent like this chance, like it's all chance how these buckets get filled. But then when you see that it's actually puppeted by, you know, the government, and there's a dividing line in the middle to make it impossible for the buckets to be filled any other way. Like that's the kind of stuff that I like try to figure out how to represent.
David, people want to talk more about the Morris building.
Okay.
Go
sure. Mayor David Briley had put together a group of about 10 of us to kind of examine the Morris building. Should it be saved? How it should be saved? Should the city of Nashville be part of that? And we met for many, many months and obviously thought that from an architectural standpoint, from a historical standpoint, from a location standpoint, it should be saved. Initially, the mayor wanted us to examine whether affordable housing money could be used, but given that you could probably only get 40 or 50 units out of this 4-story building, that would not be a good use of probably upwards of $40 million to spend to buy and renovate the building. And so Mayor Briley said he would put it in the capital budget of next year. And of course, we had another mayor's election. In comes Mayor Cooper, and who puts together a very modest capital budget, probably about a fourth of what his predecessors did. So needless to say, Morris wasn't in there. It is for sale right now by the organization, the religious organization that built it in 1924. They are talking to a group. I don't know where those talks are right now, but you know, there's no protection on the building. So if someone were to buy it for $14 million, which is basically the price, they would probably tear it down and build a 30 or 40-story tower there, which is a office building, hotel, condo, whatever you want to call it. And that's just sad. And, you know, we have no protections of some of our great properties, and we just look for people to step in and buy them. And hopefully, and that's why I thought the government was the best person, given the amount of property that the city owns near the courthouse, that they could use it, they could control the parking under the courthouse, that I always thought that they were the best person to kind of take over the Morris building. But it doesn't look like that's happening.
Can we speak to that just a little bit further too, David? Like, that is a good example. You know, if you want to tie it to something that is relevantly happened, you know, looking at the capital budget spending plan, you know, we're basically in the austerity budget because the city is broke. And if we're serious about that, it's because the city could, you know, collect revenue in two ways. That's a sales tax, which is a regressive tax, and ours is the highest in the nation, or one of the highest at 9.25, and that is by property tax. So yet people feel some way about property tax. You know, if you were to compare what you're paying in property tax to what it gives you in public services, right, you're getting a great deal, right? A wonderful deal. Unfortunately, what happens is that we think that businesses are people too, and we give them the exact same breaks that we do as individuals. So what happens is that companies like Opryland, HCA, and the rest of these big properties get out of paying thousands and thousands of property taxes that could go toward with having more money to put in a capital spending budget so that the Morris building doesn't get cut out of it, right? So again, here we are at a theme where we're talking about personal gain, where we're putting business before people. And at some point, when you talk about how we build commerce and we build the city, we got to save the soul of this city as well, right? What makes Nashville great? And that's one of the things that we should, I want to throw in that conversation talking about, David, because all of this.
And tax increment financing, we've been giving out tax increment financing for decades in downtown Nashville. It was supposed to be an incentive for developers to restore and build things. Nashville's the incentive. We haven't needed tax increment financing downtown probably in 15 years, but yet up until recently, we're still giving it to people building hotels or office buildings or things like that. I would rather give someone tax increment financing to save that Morris building and give them a cut. You know, we built the Omni for the convention center. They got about $80 million from the city. We have given out a lot of money. And as Odessa says now, We don't have any money for things. The capital budget is actually different from the regular budget. It's basically selling bonds. It's long-term debt. So, when our previous mayors, had their capital budgets, and it's usually for schools and roads and other long-term projects, they didn't mind because, somebody else will worry about that. But, Mayor Cooper has cut the capital budget down severely to only the things he feels that are absolutely needed right now. And so things like the Morris Building and other things aren't included.
Someone's asking if the Morris Building would be covered by a historic overlay. Would that be anything to help any protection at all?
It is not currently, and the only way to get an historic overlay is for it to go through the Metro Council. Freddie O'Connell was on the Morris committee that Mayor Briley had appointed, but in reality, you don't put an overlay on someone's business usually without their permission. So, for example, if they're trying to sell the Morris Building right now for $14 million, if there was an overlay on it, the price that building is worth, or really the land, drops dramatically, because most people that would want to buy the Morris Building are buying the land and want to tear down that building. So if you had to buy that building and keep the building, then your asset is worth a whole lot less.
Manuel Zylan is in the chat saying that maybe planning to agree to not give any height increases for these sites of endangered buildings. But I mean, would that even affect anything like that?
Well, the downtown code is different from other parts of the city. So you can build really, really tall buildings. There are some really tall buildings on Church Street and other buildings proposed. There's the old Federal Reserve building. There's a plan to put like a 10-story tower on top of that and make it a hotel. So downtown's always been like, well, we don't care about height. We'll just let people do what they want. So I doubt that would, happen with the Morris Building.
You're exactly right. Once you put a precedent in place, it pretty much keeps rolling.
Mm-hmm.
So how can people who are in this chat push this forward? I mean, Odessia kind of talked about, getting involved. Like, what if they want to be part of this revolution? What's like the next step for people to
tell us more about Stand Up Nashville and actually what other things you're doing right now, because, people really need to know about it and the why and kind of how they can help you.
Oh, Debbie's so sweet.
Definitely, yeah.
Well, go to standupnashville.org, sign up. We have a page there, but more importantly, first of all, given the season that we're in, go vote. We're a nonprofit organization, and so I won't say who, I won't be partisan, but exercise your right to vote. I will say what you can do is be more responsible with your vote, right? Like, my dream is to have a mayor and a city council that will sue the state every time something happens in Nashville that we don't want to see as a city. As a city, we do a good job of trying to be progressive, right? But what happens is that we get exhausted, we get tired. But change happens with being messy, tired, and exhausted, right? And we need leadership that's going to push back against what's happening. So I say that to say, Holly, when you're asking that question, who are we voting in as judges? Where is their responsibility? Because if we send it to court, we need to make sure that we have like-minded people who are thinking about, what it looks like from the judge's standpoint on how you rule in these type of cases. This will be in what, Chancery Court or something like that? So just thinking about those type of things. On top of that too, all these boards and commissions that we have here in Nashville, right? I mean, there's a lot of rich white men who sit on all of them. And that's not to say anything against rich white men, but there is a historical record of what has happened throughout the umpteenth of time when these boards are set in a certain way. Why are we not having public policy that says we have to put more people like us? All I see is lawyers and businessmen who sit on all, and developers. Those are the three that you mainly see that sit on all these boards. I haven't seen a teacher. I haven't seen a civil servant, as in a trash collector or historian, or anyone who sits on these boards, who works a 9 to 5, who's come from these communities, or who lives this working class life that has some survival mode in it. even Mark just talked about, he made a dope film, right? But he said he volunteered his time. His main job is he's hustling, scraping, or I ain't gonna say scraping, because your house looks nice in the background. You know, anyone got French doors inside their house doing all right. But anyway.
Hey, my wife is a doctor, so I got that going for me.
There you go.
But, you know, like we were talking about earlier, it comes back to us thinking like, you know, a lot of white people in this city don't understand when we talk about working class and affordable housing, or, you know, we're talking about you as well. You have to make what?
Yeah. Hey, listen.
To live in this city?
Listen. Yeah. You know, it's funny. I feel like I made a film about how white people are privileged, right? And so I wanted to use my privilege to tell people that, you know what I mean? Like I was able to take 15 months off. There aren't that many people that can do that, you know, like, so I wanted to utilize that wealth buildup that I am talking about to like say, this needs to be addressed. You know what I mean?
And so one of the reasons that redlining was outlawed and made illegal was because of the Civil Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act. The Fair Housing Act was passed 7 days after Dr. Martin Luther King was killed, and they had been sitting on it for months, and President Johnson, they passed it as a way of trying to calm the riots and everything. But over the last 4 years, some of the key parts of the Civil Rights Act and of the Fair Housing Act have been eroded. And some new laws that are being passed, I'm trying to stay non-political too. And so I'm just going to give you the time frame and let you know that over the last 4 years, most recently, the disparate impact. And disparate impact is what we're able to use to protect women who have been victims of domestic violence, whose landlords they have a rule, a neutral rule, that if you disturb your neighbors, you get evicted. And they use this rule to evict women who are victims of domestic violence because they, I guess, disturbed their neighbors when they called the police on their abuser. But by using disparate impact, we're able to bring that in under the Fair Housing Act and protect them and keep women survivors of domestic violence. They have to be otherwise eligible and be able to pay the rent and everything. But that's how we're able to protect them. And there's a new rule that passed. Fortunately, another group sued and there's an injunction against it taking effect. But that's how things are slowly being eroded over the last 4 years. Mark, you mentioned systemic racism. And so an executive order came out a few weeks ago that anyone who is a HUD contractor, that they're enter into a contract, I think it's after November 21st, meaning they get any HUD dollars, then, they cannot teach they can't teach systemic racism. They can't even mention it, really, because apparently in the executive order, it isn't supposed to exist. You can't just, yeah. So there are a lot of things that are going on at the federal level that people don't realize that are impacting the Fair Housing Act, that are going to have a serious trickle-down effect to housing rights the very things that made redlining illegal, that made the discriminatory clauses in deeds where you could not sell your home to an African American, or, you know, those are still in some of these old deeds. They're just not enforceable. And all of that is because of the Fair Housing Act.
Yeah.
So it is very important to be mindful, you know, on how you vote, and make sure that we can get a good state legislature to at least be able to enact some protections on the state level, even if the federal laws are getting watered down and removed.
We're at the time. We're at 6:30. But I think if people wanted to stay in the chat, like, we would hang out. Is that correct?
Sure.
But anyone who needed to bow out, now's the time. Panelists, I'd love for you guys to just say one last thing, you know, before signing off. David, starting with you.
Well, Holly, thank you for putting this together. It's a very timely topic. It's a good topic and a great panel and people. Mark, your film was just extraordinary. A lot of people in the chat want to see it shown in various places here in Nashville. So I hope we will have an opportunity to have a wider audience. You know, the graphics were just great and it was the right length. And, you know, although it wasn't Nashville specific, as you found out today, there's so many stories that most communities can definitely relate to. So I agree with Odessa, get involved, vote. You know, our Metro Council, we have one of the largest city councils in America, 40 people. Everyone thinks that they do all these things for education or quality of life. They don't really. It's the largest zoning body in America. So 80% of what you see coming from the Metro Council are zoning bills about real estate and property so people can build and develop. So run for council, stay on your council about why did you rezone this property, or why do you want, what are you up to? And so I think we all have to work together. So thank you.
Odessa?
Yeah, great panel. Excellent film. I wrote down so many notes that I learned just film and listen to Kathy and David talk about other things to look up. Holly, thank you for inviting me to be here. Yeah, to what David said, two things you can definitely start looking at more is like our procurement. If you don't know what procurement is, just Google it and look at what it is. Like, we need stronger and more enforcement in our procurement standards and how those desperately affect us here. And that ties back into redlining. And two, looking at, you know, how do we give better protection to employees, like workers, you know, like the more economics, sustainability that we have, a lot of these other things will solve or go away, right? You know, we didn't even get a chance to talk about the debt was created out of this and how that holds people back, right? So just us finding, you know, public policy, ways through public policies to mitigate the harm that is happening to the working class, which is always happening to marginalized classes, Black communities, or, you know, communities of color, is one of the things that is vital, you know, not just for African Americans to do, but for everyone to do if we really want to live in a progressive city. We call ourselves a blue city in a red state. I challenge everyone to define what progressivism means, you know, not just, you know, just because you got a Black friend doesn't mean that you're progressive, but how are you really, you know, and that for African Americans, that has to happen through public policies where we can be protected and have access to go forward.
Mm-hmm. Kathy?
I'm just so appreciative and excited that you invited me to be on this panel with David and Odessa, because a lot of times what I deal with are the laws, and I'm not able to, I haven't met everyone yet and had the opportunity to figure out how to partner. So I would encourage everyone, vote, but be knowledgeable in your voting and go to your city council meetings. A lot of times, Odessa mentioned the zoning, and NIMBYism is an old term, and it used to talk about group homes, but these days it's talking about a lot of times the location of affordable housing or workforce housing. And in Nashville, a lot of housing is not affordable. You're a lot of times the people who teach your kids or keep your houses from burning down can't live where they work. But the people who oppose these affordable housing locations don't necessarily even live in the neighborhood where they're wanting to be sited. And so go and be informed. I think now they're doing them virtually, but be informed. Be informed on the state and even on the federal level, because the Fair Housing Act has really taken a hit, and it intersects so many areas that people don't think about. People with disabilities, that's our highest right now. That's our highest caseload, are people with disabilities. So vote, be informed, reach out to Stand Up Nashville, volunteer, but be informed. And I think that's what I would say. And thanks again. This has really been, I've learned so much, and I've really learned a lot from both David and Odessa.
I think it's important, as we are developing so fast, and we're talking about new Nashville, old Nashville. Like David said, we got to go back further. We're talking, people are making decisions about Nashville that weren't here for the flood. They weren't here 20 years ago. And, learning about where we've been is really important when we're trying to preserve moving forward. So I think that's it. If anyone has anything, throw it in the chat. And thank you guys for coming out. This was really awesome, and good to see everybody's faces virtually. So
yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah, this was awesome. Thank you.
And thank you again, Mark, for being with us too. We really
totally.
Yeah. That was a great film.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm from Austin, so it was good to hear that Austin's not the only city that messed up big time.
Hit me up, Mark, on other projects too. So if you need to help storyboards and how to make this simple for people to understand.
Yeah, definitely.
That's my idea.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your night, okay?
Thank you.
Everyone.